She stood in that attorney's office, 34 years of marriage behind her, and watched a lawyer slide a single sheet of paper across the desk. It listed her husband's real net worth. She had never seen that number before, not once, in 34 years. And that was the moment she realized she hadn't just been kept in the dark about the money. She had been kept in the dark about everything. The man she had loved since she was 26 years old, the man she had cooked breakfast for, and raised children with, and held through every setback, and celebrated through every quiet victory. That man had been living a double life, not with another woman, not with a secret family, with a secret empire. And the most devastating part? He thought he was doing it for her. My name is Margaret, and this is my story. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And please don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now let's go all the way back to the beginning, because to understand how a story like this is even possible, you have to understand the ground it was built on. You have to go back before the money, before the marriage, before the name Richard Edward Calloway meant anything to anyone. You have to go back to a boy in Asheville, North Carolina, in the late 1950s, watching his father eat breakfast before a long day at work, not knowing that the world his father had built was already beginning to crack underneath him. You have to go back to that kitchen table, because everything, every trust, every shell company, every carefully maintained illusion, started at that table. Not with greed, with grief. Gerald Calloway was not a complicated man. He was, by every account of the people who knew him, a man defined by two qualities above all others: an extraordinary capacity for work and an absolute, unshakable trust in the people he chose to call his own. He had built his construction supply business from a single truck and a handshake reputation that stretched across the western counties of North Carolina. He had started in 1952, the year after he came home from Korea, with $200 in savings and a willingness to outwork every competitor in the market. By 1960, he had 12 employees and a warehouse on the outskirts of Asheville. By 1965, he had expanded to 3 counties and was supplying materials to some of the largest residential construction projects in the region. He was not rich, but he was building something. He could feel it under his hands, solid and real, the way a craftsman feels the quality of the wood before he cuts it. He was proud of what he had made, and he trusted the man beside him the way a man trusts the ground, because the ground had always held. Victor Sloane had come into Gerald's life in 1958, introduced through a mutual contact in the building trades as a man with financing experience and an interest in the construction supply sector. He was polished in a way that Gerald was not, educated at a small college in Virginia, comfortable in rooms that made Gerald slightly uneasy. But he was generous, reliably present, and over the years, as his involvement in the business deepened, from advisor to partner to the man whose name appeared beside Gerald's on the incorporation documents, he had made himself indispensable in the particular way that certain kinds of people specialize in, not through exceptional competence, but through an exceptional understanding of how to be needed. He was at the Calloway house for holidays. He knew the boys by name, knew their school grades, brought them baseball cards from a shop in downtown Asheville. Richard, the middle boy, called him Uncle Victor until he was 12 years old. Then, something changed. The warmth in Victor's visits began to cool slightly, almost imperceptibly, in the way that certain people's warmth cools when they no longer need something from you. Richard noticed it. He was 12 years old, and he noticed it in the way that sensitive children notice the texture of the air in a room before the adults understand that anything has shifted. He said nothing. He watched. What happened over the next 2 years was, in its way, a masterpiece of financial engineering, though not the kind that creates anything of value. Victor Sloane had been, for the better part of 2 years, quietly restructuring the legal architecture of the business they jointly owned. He had done it through documents that Gerald had signed at his request, in meetings that Gerald had attended, with the trusting attention of a man who does not believe the person across the table is doing anything other than what they say they are doing. He had moved asset ownership into entities that Gerald did not fully understand. He had established a series of transfers that, when examined by the attorney Gerald eventually hired after the fact, formed a chain of legal title that ended not with Gerald Calloway, But with Victor Sloane, alone, all of it, the warehouse, the contracts, the relationships, the inventory, the name, everything Gerald had built from nothing over 16 years, Victor had prepared for 2 years and executed in 8 months, and by the time the courthouse in Buncombe County had finished processing the final documents, Gerald Calloway was left with his truck, his reputation, and his debt. The business was Victor Sloane's. Legally, cleanly, and entirely. Gerald fought it. Of course he fought it. He hired the best attorney he could afford, which was not a particularly good attorney, and spent 2 years and most of what remained of his savings pursuing a legal remedy that his attorney privately believed, from the beginning, had very limited prospects. The law, in this case, was not Gerald's friend. The documents were real. The signatures were genuine. The transfers had been executed correctly. Victor Sloane had done nothing that could be proved illegal. He had simply done something that was, in every meaningful human sense, a profound betrayal. The betrayal of a man who had given him trust and access and decades of loyalty, and whom he had used as a vehicle for his own enrichment without a moment of hesitation or apparent remorse. The case was dismissed in 1975. Gerald was 51 years old. Richard was 20. He sat in the back of that courtroom and watched his father walk out of it, a diminished man, and something locked inside him that would not open again for the rest of his life. Gerald Calloway never fully recovered. He worked for the remainder of his years in various capacities in the building trades, not as an owner, but as a laborer, a delivery driver, a man who worked with his hands because that was the only capital he had left. He was not bitter in the way of men who have been broken by bitterness into something sharp and destructive. He was quiet in the way of men who have been broken into something quieter, a kind of permanent, low-level sadness that settled into the architecture of his days like weather that never quite lifts. He was kind, he was present, he showed up for his boys, and he loved his wife, and he did not, as far as anyone around him could tell, spend his remaining years in active resentment toward Victor Sloane. He had simply, over those years, lost the particular quality of aliveness that a man has when he believes the future is going to be better than the past. He died in 1981 at the age of 57. His obituary said he was a well-loved member of the Asheville community and a dedicated family man. It did not mention the business. It did not mention the courthouse. Richard attended the funeral, stood at the graveside in a suit that was slightly too large for him, and made a private promise to his father and to himself that he would never repeat Gerald's mistake. He would never give another human being the kind of access that could be used against him. Not a business partner, not a colleague, not a friend. He stood at that grave and closed a door inside himself. And then he went and built an empire on the other side of it. Now, here is where this story takes a turn that most people, when they hear the outline of it, do not anticipate. Because most people, when they hear about a man who hides his wealth from his family, picture a certain kind of man, cold, calculating, unloving, self-serving, a man for whom secrecy is a tool of control, a way of keeping power concentrated in his own hands. And Richard Calloway was not that man. This is the part that makes the story so much harder to resolve into something clean. He was, in every dimension that did not involve money, a genuinely devoted husband and father. He showed up. He was present in the kitchen on Saturday mornings, making pancakes that Daniel and Caroline still referenced in their adult conversations as the best they had ever eaten. He coached Little League for 3 seasons. He sat through every school play, every parent-teacher conference, every graduation. He was the father who drove through the night when Daniel called from college with a car problem, who flew to Durham without being asked when Caroline had emergency surgery in her late 20s. The love was not a performance. The people who knew the Calloway family from the outside saw a normal, functional, affectionate household, and they were not wrong about what they saw. They were simply, without knowing it, seeing only the part that Richard had decided was safe to show. Margaret saw this. She saw it clearly. Not all at once, not in a single revelatory moment, but gradually, over the decades of their marriage, in the accumulation of small signals that she processed and filed away without fully acting on, because none of them, individually, was alarming enough to override the fundamental trust she had in the man she had chosen. There were the financial deflections, gentle, always reasonable, always delivered with enough specificity to close the question without opening a larger one. There were the occasional moments where she would ask about an account or a business decision, and Richard's answer would have the quality of a carefully prepared statement rather than a natural response, something slightly too smooth, as if it had been rehearsed for exactly this question. There were the times she had noticed him on the phone in his home office late at night, speaking in the particular quiet of a man who is not worried about being overheard, but has simply arranged his life so that certain conversations happen in certain rooms. She had noticed all of it. She had, for 34 years, noticed all of it and filed it in the part of her mind where she kept the things she had decided, consciously or otherwise, not to pursue. Because the life was good, because the love was real, and because there is a kind of trust that operates not on evidence, but on a deeper, more fundamental conviction about who a person is. She had that conviction about Richard. She held it for 34 years, and it survived even the revelation that should have destroyed it. Let's talk about Margaret Renee Davenport Calloway as she was in her own right, because this story is hers as much as anyone's, and it deserves to be told with the fullness she deserves. She grew up in Greensboro, the second of 4 children in a family that was solidly middle class in the way of Greensboro families in the 1960s. Her father was an accountant, her mother taught second grade for 31 years, and the household was run on a foundation of practical intelligence, emotional directness, and a deep, ingrained ethic of doing what you say you will do. Margaret had inherited all of these qualities in full measure. She was the student who organized her notes before class. She was the friend who showed up with food when you were sick without being asked. She was the young woman who, when she fell in love for the first time in college, did it with the same combination of wholehearted commitment and clear-eyed practicality that characterized everything else she approached. She was not a naive person. She was not a woman who trusted without reason. She trusted Richard because she had spent 3 years watching him before she agreed to marry him. And in those 3 years, he had given her every reason to conclude that he was exactly who he appeared to be. She was right about almost everything. She was wrong about one thing, and that one thing turned out to be the foundation of their entire life together. Her decision to step back from her teaching career when the children were young was not a sacrifice she made under pressure. She made it because she believed in it, because she had watched her own mother balance work and family with a kind of sustained exhaustion that she wanted to avoid, and because the financial situation of the household, as she understood it, was comfortable enough to support the choice. What she did not know was that the financial situation of the household was not comfortable in the modest, carefully managed way she believed. It was stratospheric. It was, from the mid-1990s onward, the kind of financial situation that most people encounter only in news articles. But she had no way to know that, because Richard had built the life around her at exactly the right scale to support the story he was telling. The house was the right size for a successful but not extravagant businessman. The cars were appropriate. The vacations were generous without being ostentatious. Every single material element of her life had been calibrated to confirm a narrative that was not, in any meaningful sense, true. She had not been denied luxury. She had been denied knowledge. And the distinction, when she finally came to understand it fully, was the thing that made her simultaneously furious and, in a way she could not entirely account for, profoundly sad. Not for herself, for him, for the man who had worked so hard to maintain an illusion that he had, in the end, imprisoned himself inside it. When Margaret returned to work as a curriculum coordinator for the Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools in the early 2000s, after Caroline left for college, and the house was quiet, in the particular way of a house that has finished its primary purpose, she found something that she had not entirely expected to find: herself. Not a different self from the woman who had been a wife and mother for 20 years, but a more complete version of that woman. A version that had her own calendar, her own professional relationships, her own sense of competence, that did not derive from or depend upon anything Richard did or did not provide. She was good at her job. She was respected by her colleagues. She found in the work a satisfaction that was different from, but not lesser than what she had found in the years of raising children, and she carried herself in those years with the specific confidence of a woman who has stopped waiting for something to begin and has noticed that, actually, it already has. She was happy. She was genuinely, substantively happy. And this is the particular cruelty of the revelation that was coming. It arrived not at a low point, not at a moment of vulnerability or doubt, but in the middle of the best decade of her adult life. It arrived when she had the least reason to be looking for it, and the most to lose from finding it. Now let us spend some real time with Thomas Wren, because Thomas is one of the most quietly significant figures in this entire story, and he has never been given the space he deserves. Thomas had grown up in a family that took the law seriously in the particular way of families that have been on the wrong side of it. His grandfather had been a tenant farmer in the Piedmont region of North Carolina who had lost his lease through legal mechanisms he didn't understand. And this ancestral dispossession had translated, through the generations, into a family ethos that treated legal knowledge as a form of armor. Thomas had gone to law school at Wake Forest University, graduated in the top third of his class, and gone directly into financial and estate planning, where his particular gift for anticipating structural vulnerabilities in complex arrangements had made him, by his mid-30s, one of the most sought-after private wealth structuring attorneys in the region. He had met Richard through a referral in 1988, had taken the initial consultation expecting a routine engagement, and had found himself, in the first hour of conversation with this quiet, intense, meticulously prepared logistics entrepreneur, understanding immediately that here was a man who required not just competence, but alignment. Richard did not want advice, he wanted execution. He wanted someone who understood exactly what he was trying to build and why, and who would build it with him without requiring explanations that Richard was not prepared to give. Thomas had provided all of that for 30 years, and the weight of it, the specific moral and professional weight of being the one person in the world who held the complete picture of what Richard had built, while watching the family around that wealth live in managed ignorance of it, had become, over the decades, something Thomas carried differently than he had when it started. In the early years, it had felt like professional discretion, which it was. In the middle years, it had felt like loyalty, which it also was. But by the time the Calloway children were adults, by the time Margaret was a working professional with a life of her own, Thomas had begun to experience something he would describe, in his more honest moments, as a low-grade moral discomfort that he could not entirely reason away. He was not naive about the law. He understood that Richard's arrangements were legal. He understood that a man had an absolute right to structure his finances as he chose, within the limits of the law, and that what Richard had done was on the right side of that line, even when it stretched toward its edge. But the law's permission was not, Thomas had come to understand over the years, identical to moral clarity, and the gap between what the law permitted and what Thomas's own conscience occasionally flagged had narrowed, without ever closing, as the years went on and the family around the secret grew older and the secret grew larger. He had tried once, as already described, to raise the transparency question with Richard. He had been heard and declined. What has not yet been described is what happened after that conversation, not the legal restructuring that followed, but the private exchange between two men who had worked together for 15 years and who, in the particular intimacy of that kind of professional relationship, had developed something that functioned, for both of them, as a form of friendship that neither would have named as such. After Richard had declined the transparency discussion, after the meeting had formally concluded, Thomas had stood up to leave and had paused at the door and had said, without turning around, something that he would not repeat to anyone for many years. "I want you to understand that I'm going to keep doing my job, but I want you to also understand that the day is coming when this is going to cost someone something they shouldn't have to pay." Richard had been quiet for a long time. Then he had said, "I know." Just that. 2 words. And Thomas had left. And neither of them had ever referred to that exchange again. But Thomas had not forgotten it. He carried it with him for the remainder of their professional relationship, the way a person carries a conversation that was important enough to remember, but not resolved enough to put down. The relationship between Thomas and the Calloway children was almost non-existent by design. He knew who they were. He had seen photographs on Richard's desk over the years. He knew their names, their general life situations, The outlines of their characters, as Richard occasionally described them in passing, Daniel's entrepreneurial volatility, Caroline's quiet purposefulness. But he had never met them, had never been introduced, had never been present at any family occasion where their paths might cross. This was deliberate on Richard's part, a separation of worlds that was as complete as he could make it. Thomas was the other world, the real world, the world that the family did not know existed. And Thomas had accepted this arrangement because it was what the arrangement required, and because he was, above all things, professional in the deepest sense of that word. A man who understood that his role was to serve his clients' defined interests without imposing his own judgments on the choices those interests reflected. He had done that for 30 years. He had done it so completely and so faithfully that when the moment came, when Richard called him after Daniel's inquiry at the Tennessee courthouse, Thomas's first impulse had not been to consider whether to tell Richard. His first impulse was to protect the architecture. It was the only impulse he had practiced for 3 decades. It was the only one he knew. The 6 weeks that Raymond Cross spent building his report were, from Daniel's perspective, 6 weeks of mounting excitement of a kind that he recognized, even at the time, as somewhat shameful. He tried, in those weeks, to frame his feelings in terms that were morally comfortable. He was uncovering an injustice. He was acting on behalf of his family, including his mother, who had lived for 34 years without the knowledge she deserved. He was correcting a wrong. These framings were not entirely dishonest. There was genuine injustice at the core of what he had discovered, and his anger at his father was not manufactured. But underneath the moral framing was something rawer and less dignified, something he would not admit even to himself in those weeks. He was excited about the money. Not in a simple, greedy way. Daniel was not, at his core, a greedy person, but in the way of a man who has spent his adult life feeling financially inadequate in relation to an image of his father that was, he now understood, a fiction. He had been told no his entire life by a man who was worth $4 billion. The no had shaped him, had defined his relationship to risk, to ambition, to his own sense of what he was capable of, and now the no was revealed as a lie. The anger that produced was real, the desire to be compensated for it, financially, legally, publicly, was also real. And those two realities sat inside him, unreconciled, through those 6 weeks of waiting for Raymond Cross to finish the work. What he had not accounted for, in the architecture of his planning during those weeks, was his sister. He had assessed Caroline as he always assessed her, as a careful person, a principled person, someone who would need to be persuaded rather than simply recruited. He had prepared for persuasion. He had prepared a specific framing of the moral and financial argument that he believed would appeal to her particular sensibility, not the money itself, but the justice of it, the principle that their father had no right to make choices of this magnitude unilaterally, that Margaret's 34 years of contribution to the household deserved recognition and compensation, that the family's collective future deserved to be built on honesty rather than secrets. He had rehearsed this argument. He believed in it, or believed enough of it to deliver it with conviction. What he had not prepared for was the quality of attention Caroline brought to that dinner table, or the specific silence with which she received what he said, or the particular phrase she used when she set down the pages of the report. "Let me think about it." Those 4 words, delivered with the flat, measured calm that he knew, if he thought about it honestly, was never actually calm at all, but was always, with Caroline, the surface of something working very hard underneath. He drove home from Durham that night, believing he had planted a seed. He had not planted a seed. He had been observed. Caroline's documentation process was meticulous in the way of a person who has spent her professional life building cases for people who could not build them for themselves. She worked in affordable housing advocacy because she believed, with the specific conviction of someone who has seen its absence, in the fundamental importance of documented truth. Not abstract truth, documented truth, the kind that exists in writing, in records, in a form that can be produced in a room where someone is disputing it. She had learned this in her early years at the non-profit, watching cases turn on the difference between what someone remembered and what someone had written down at the time. She had internalized it so completely that it had become a kind of reflex. When something important happened, she recorded it, not compulsively, not anxiously, with the same calm deliberateness with which she did everything else. So when Daniel had laid those pages on the table and proposed what he proposed, she had listened with the complete attention of a person who understands that she is being recruited into something whose full dimensions she cannot yet see, and she had photographed the pages and recorded the conversation and gone home and written down every specific thing her brother had said, in the specific words he had used, with the specific implications of those words laid out clearly in her own language. She did not know yet what she would do with that record. She only knew that she should have it, that having it was the right thing. And that was enough. The period between Daniel's dinner with Caroline and the filing of the competency petition was approximately 8 weeks. During those 8 weeks, the Calloway family, if it could still be called that in any functional sense, operated in 3 entirely separate registers of activity, none of which the others were fully aware of. Daniel was working with his attorney to construct the competency petition, gathering the financial documentation that Raymond Cross had produced, preparing the legal argument, and working to secure his mother's participation with an urgency that his attorney had flagged, on more than one occasion, as a potential structural problem. Margaret was working with Sandra Holloway on the divorce and equitable distribution case, processing the emotional dimensions of the revelation in the particular way of a woman who prefers action to paralysis, and trying to understand the full scope of what her life had been built on. Caroline was documenting, watching, and waiting with a patience that was not passivity, but something she would have described, if asked, as strategic stillness, the particular discipline of a person who has learned that the most powerful move is sometimes to do nothing visible while doing a great deal that is not. And Richard, in the large house in Charlotte, with the modest furniture and the 6-year-old car in the driveway, was moving assets, retaining litigators, and waiting for the next thing to happen with the specific serenity of a man who has spent 40 years anticipating and preparing for exactly this kind of threat. There is something that needs to be said about what Richard was feeling during those 8 weeks, because feelings are not irrelevant to this story, even when the central figure is not a man who discusses his feelings. Richard was, in those weeks, experiencing something that he had no ready framework for, because it was not the threat itself that was affecting him most. He had prepared for the threat. He had, in a very real sense, been preparing for it his entire adult life. What he had not prepared for, what no amount of financial engineering or legal structuring can prepare you for, was the specific pain of watching the people he had built his life to protect become the source of the danger he had spent his life protecting against. It was not an abstract pain, it was the most specific kind, the kind that comes from the recognition that the very precautions you took in order to prevent a particular loss have produced, through their own logic, the conditions for that loss to occur anyway. His father had trusted without structures and been destroyed by a man he loved. Richard had built structures specifically to prevent that outcome, and now the structures were being challenged by his own son, and his wife was in a lawyer's office preparing to litigate against him, and the walls he had spent his life building had not kept the threat out. They had, instead, produced it from the inside. He understood this. He was, above all things, honest with himself in the privacy of his own mind. And the understanding of it sat with him, in those weeks, with the specific weight of a man who is too honest to pretend he did not play a role in building the conditions of his own undoing. He called Caroline once during those weeks, not to discuss the legal situation, not to recruit her or warn her or ask anything of her at all. He called on a Tuesday evening in April, at around 7 o'clock, and asked her how she was. She said she was fine. He asked about her work, about a specific project she had mentioned the last time they had spoken. She told him about it. He listened. They talked for 22 minutes about her work, about an affordable housing development in East Durham that her organization had been fighting for 3 years to bring to completion, about the particular satisfaction of watching something she had believed in finally move toward reality. He asked good questions. She answered them fully, and at the end of the call he said, "I'm proud of you, Caroline. I want you to know that." She said thank you. He said good night. She sat with the phone in her hand after the call ended and understood, with the clarity of a person who knows her father well enough to read what is not said, that he had just told her everything he was able to tell her. that this was the most complete communication he was capable of in the circumstances, that the 22 minutes about the housing development were not a deflection, they were the point. He was telling her, in the only language he fully commanded, that she was the thing he valued most, and she received it in the only language she fully understood, quietly, completely, and without needing it said any plainer. The hearing on the competency petition took place on a Wednesday in October. The courtroom was not crowded. These proceedings rarely attract public attention when they involve private citizens rather than celebrities, and the Calloway family's wealth had been, until very recently, entirely invisible to the world. The attorney for Daniel's side made his opening argument for 40 minutes. He presented the financial decisions Richard had allegedly made that suggested erratic judgment, 3 in total, each of which Richard's team had already prepared detailed, documented rebuttals for. He presented a psychiatric assessment conducted by a single physician who had met with Richard on 2 occasions. He presented the financial complexity of the estate as itself evidence of cognitive overreach, arguing that no single individual of sound mind could maintain awareness of structures this complex without error. The argument was not without surface plausibility. In isolation, some of its elements might have given a court pause, but it was not in isolation. Richard's team responded with 11 independent physicians, with 20 years of audited financial records, with testimony from business partners, attorneys, and financial professionals who had worked with Richard across decades, and whose descriptions of his mental acuity were, taken together, a portrait of a man whose mind operated with a precision and consistency that the single psychiatric assessment from Daniel's team could not credibly challenge. Richard testified for 3 hours. He was, by all accounts, exceptional, not aggressive, not defensive, simply clear, precise, specific. A man answering questions the way a man answers questions when he has nothing to hide and no reason to perform. The judge had seen a great deal in his years on the bench. He had not seen a competency petition this thin brought against a respondent this formidable. He dismissed it in 45 minutes. What the ruling said, in its written form, was as important as what it did, because the judge's dismissal did not simply find insufficient evidence. It found insufficient foundation. The written ruling noted that the petition appeared to rest, in part, on documentation of uncertain provenance, a careful judicial formulation that meant, in the language of courts, that the Singapore document was problematic and its origin was being flagged for further review. This was not an accusation. It was a marker, a notation in the public record that something about the evidentiary basis of this petition did not hold up under scrutiny, and that the appropriate parties should examine why. For Daniel, reading that language through his attorney's explanation, it was the specific chill of a man who has made a move he cannot take back and who is beginning to understand the full dimensions of where he is. For Richard's legal team, it was a door, not a wide door, but a door, and they intended to use it. Margaret read the ruling. Sandra Holloway had called her with the result before it was formally filed, and Margaret had sat with the phone pressed to her ear and felt something she had not expected to feel. Relief. Not because Richard had won. The divorce proceedings were still very much ongoing, and her legal position had not materially changed, but because the competency petition had always felt wrong to her in a way she had not been able to fully articulate until it was over. It had felt wrong not because she didn't believe the wealth was hidden, she knew now, beyond any doubt, that it was, but because she knew Richard. She had known him for 36 years, since before the marriage, since the 3 years of sitting across from him in restaurants and watching him navigate the world with the specific, unrushed intelligence of a man who does not need to perform for anyone. She knew he was not in cognitive decline. She had known it the day she signed on to Daniel's petition, had known it and had signed anyway because the Singapore document and her own rage and grief had temporarily overridden what she knew. And sitting with the phone after Sandra's call, she felt the particular internal clarity of a woman who has returned to herself. She had lost her footing. She had found it again. The ground under her had been different from what she thought, but it was still ground, and she was still standing on it. The conversation with Daniel about the Singapore document happened on a Thursday morning, 3 days after the ruling. She called him from her car, parked in the lot outside her office building. because she had learned in the previous months that there were certain conversations that required the specific privacy of a car, a sealed space with no other occupants, no possibility of interruption, no reason to moderate herself for anyone else's comfort. She asked him directly and without preamble where the document had come from. He told her Raymond Cross. She told him Sandra's team had been unable to verify the entity the document referenced. She told him that a second investigation she had commissioned independently had reached the same conclusion. There was a silence. Daniel was not a man who silenced easily, and the silence lasted long enough to confirm what she had already concluded. She did not raise her voice. She was her mother's daughter and her father's wife, and she did not raise her voice, but what she said in that car, measured and permanent, and without any room for misinterpretation, was something that Daniel Calloway would carry with him for the rest of his life. She said, "You used me, Daniel. You found out your father had hidden the truth from me for 34 years, and your response was to hide a different truth from me. I want you to think about what that says. Not to me, to yourself." She ended the call. She sat in the car for a few minutes, and then she walked back into the building and went to work. The counterfiling from Richard's legal team arrived at Daniel's attorney's office on a Monday morning, 11 days after the dismissal. It was 42 pages long, carefully sourced, and built on the specific structure of a fraud allegation that used the Singapore document as its central exhibit, not to prove financial harm, which was a more difficult argument to sustain, but to establish a pattern of deliberate misrepresentation in a legal proceeding. The allegation was that Daniel, through his legal team, had knowingly introduced a fabricated document into a competency proceeding in order to secure the co-participation of a key party, Margaret, whose involvement was essential to the case's credibility. The filing cited the judge's own language from the dismissal ruling. It cited the results of the independent investigation that Margaret had commissioned. It cited specific language from Daniel's dinner conversation with Caroline, language that had been documented at the time and was now reproduced in the filing, with a precision that told Daniel exactly what his sister had done and when she had done it. He read that section 3 times. He had not believed, even after the ruling, that Caroline had actively worked against him. He had believed she had simply declined to participate. The filing corrected that understanding completely and permanently. The negotiation of the settlement of the counterfiling took 8 months. The terms are sealed. What is known, through the partial public record and through the accounts of people with direct knowledge of the proceedings, is this: Daniel Calloway, in the final resolution of both the failed competency petition and the counterfiling it had generated, ended up in a financial position significantly worse than the one he had occupied before he ever opened the Raymond Cross report. His legal fees alone were in the several millions. His exposure in the fraud allegation, while never fully adjudicated, the parties settled before a trial verdict, resulted in a financial penalty substantial enough to require him to liquidate most of his remaining personal assets. The technology staffing firm he had been running, already marginal, did not survive the disruption of 22 months of litigation. He was, at 48 years old, starting over in a way he had never anticipated and had never prepared for. He had wanted the money he believed was owed to him. He had ended up with less than he had started with. It would be easy, and it would be wrong, to end Daniel's story there. As a cautionary tale, a moral fable about the wages of greed and deception. Because Daniel Calloway was not simply a greedy man. He was a wounded man who made choices under the influence of that wound that he had not thought all the way through, and those choices had consequences that were disproportionate to the original injury, even while being, in a strictly legal sense, proportionate to the actions they had produced. He had done something real. He had fabricated a document and used it to manipulate his own mother into a legal proceeding that damaged her interests as well as his father's. That was not a small thing. The legal system's response to it was not unjust. But sitting with the full weight of what happened to Daniel Calloway, it is difficult not to feel something that is not quite sympathy, but is adjacent to it. Because he had been shaped, as surely as his sister had been shaped, by the same childhood, by the same household managed by the same careful, loving, completely opaque father who had decided, for reasons that made sense only inside his own private architecture of fear, that his children should grow up believing they had less than they did. That decision had shaped Daniel into something his father had not intended, and Richard had been honest enough with himself, in those later years, to carry that alongside everything else he carried. Let us now return to Margaret's side of the story, because it is, in the end, her story more than anyone else's. The divorce proceedings were, as Sandra Holloway had promised, long. They were long, and they were expensive, and they were conducted, for the most part, with a formality and distance that allowed both Margaret and Richard to function professionally through the duration without fully confronting each other. They did not see each other during the main proceedings. Their attorneys communicated. Their financial experts communicated. Forensic accountants retained by both sides spent over a year mapping the full extent of the estate, a process that was complicated by the sophistication of the structures Thomas had built and by the fact that Richard, while not obstructing the process, was not making it any simpler than it needed to be. He complied with disclosure requirements because his attorneys had advised him that non-compliance would be both legally dangerous and strategically counterproductive. But compliance and simplification are not the same thing, and the mapping of a 40-year financial architecture built specifically to resist external examination was a process that took the time it took, regardless of cooperation. What gave Sandra Holloway the foundation for the settlement she eventually achieved was not the financial forensics alone, though those were essential. It was a legal argument that she had begun developing early in the proceedings, and that drew on a body of case law around the concept of economic partnership in marriage. The argument, stated simply, was this: Margaret Calloway had been a full economic partner in the Calloway household for 34 years. She had raised the children, had managed the home, had provided the stable personal and domestic infrastructure that allowed Richard to operate in the focused, undistracted way that his empire building required. The fact that she had done this without knowing the scale of what she was helping to build did not diminish her contribution to the building of it. She had provided what she had provided. The fruits of that provision were, in their character, marital. The structures Richard had used to hold them were legal, but the structures did not change the fundamental nature of the assets they contained. This was the argument. It was not new in legal theory, but Sandra's team built it with a specificity and a documentary foundation that made it, in this particular case, exceptionally strong. The settlement figure reflects that strength. Margaret's life after the settlement is, in its own way, the most remarkable part of the story. Not because of what she received. The money was real and meaningful, and it changed the material circumstances of her life in ways that were significant. But because of what she did with the change. She moved to Durham. She bought a house in her own name. She went back to work full-time, and eventually, in the years after the settlement, returned to graduate school at UNC Chapel Hill to complete a doctoral degree in educational policy that she had begun and set aside 30 years earlier when Daniel was born. She completed that degree at the age of 64. She walked across a stage in Chapel Hill on a May afternoon and received it from the hands of a university official who did not know her name or her story, who simply handed her the document and shook her hand and moved to the next graduate. And she stood on that stage and felt something that she said afterward she had not felt in many years, the specific, uncomplicated satisfaction of a thing finished, a thing that was entirely and without qualification hers. Nobody's secret, nobody's architecture, nobody's managed story, hers. She also, in those years, began doing something that surprised people who knew her. She began talking about financial literacy, not as a professional pursuit exactly, though it eventually became one, but as a form of testimony. She began speaking to women's groups, to community organizations, to professional associations, about the specific and underexamined vulnerability of women who are financially dependent on partners who control all information about the household's financial reality. She did not present herself as a victim in these talks. She was too precise for that formulation. She presented herself as a case study, as a woman who had been intelligent, capable, attentive, and completely uninformed about the financial ground she was standing on, and who wanted other women to understand that those four qualities could coexist, and that the coexistence was not a personal failing but a structural condition that required a structural response. She told them what she had learned. She told them what questions to ask. She told them that trusting your partner was not incompatible with knowing what you both owned and owed, and that the argument that financial knowledge would damage intimacy was, in her experience, an argument that served only the person making it. She spoke with a clarity and a lack of bitterness that rooms full of women found both instructive and, in a way they sometimes struggled to articulate, almost unbearably moving. Because she was not angry on the stage, she had been angry. Enormously, justifiably, completely. But she had moved through the anger into something else, something more useful. Something that served not just her but the women sitting in those rooms who recognized something of their own lives in what she was describing. Caroline ran the Calloway Foundation from its formal establishment in the year of Richard's death, with the same quiet, systematic purposefulness with which she had done everything in her life. The foundation was endowed with a portion of the estate designated specifically for that purpose, focused, as Richard had intended, on financial literacy programs, small business development support for first-generation entrepreneurs in the Appalachian region, and educational access initiatives in the counties where his family's roots ran deepest. Caroline hired carefully and slowly. She did not build quickly. She built in a way that was designed to last, to compound over time, to serve the communities it was built for, not in the performative way of organizations that need to demonstrate impact quickly, but in the patient, structural way of an institution that understands its own timescale. The foundation, in its first decade, disbursed grants to over 200 small businesses and funded financial literacy programming that reached more than 15,000 people across western and central North Carolina. Richard had never been publicly known as a philanthropist. His daughter made sure that, in the end, the giving was real enough that the invisibility of the giver no longer mattered. She also did something, in those years, that only a handful of people knew about. She established, through the foundation, a specific grant program for women navigating financial transition, divorce, widowhood, the sudden need to manage finances that a partner had previously controlled. The program provided not just financial assistance, but financial education, legal consultation, and what Caroline called navigational support, a network of resources designed to help women understand, in practical and specific terms, the landscape of their financial situation and the choices available to them within it. The program was not named for anyone. It did not carry her father's name or her mother's name or her own. It was simply called the Compass Fund. And it was, though only Caroline knew this and had never said it publicly, the most direct expression of what she felt the family story required from her. Not a memorial to what had happened, but a response to it. A structural response to a structural problem. The kind that would still be working when everyone involved was long gone. Thomas Wren retired 2 years after Richard's death. He had by then been practicing for nearly 40 years, and the Calloway matter had been, in the final accounting of his career, both its most complex engagement and its most personally significant. He did not speak about it publicly. He did not write about it. He accepted the bequest Richard had designated for him with a private acknowledgement that was characteristic of both men, understated, direct, and closed to further discussion. He continued to live in the house outside Raleigh that he and his wife Patricia had shared for 35 years, and he spent his retirement doing the things that lawyers who have spent decades in the service of other people's complex lives tend to do when those lives are finally no longer their responsibility. He gardened, he read, he took his grandchildren to minor league baseball games. He cooked elaborate weekend meals for Patricia that she did not ask for and appreciated completely. He did not think about the Calloway estate every day, but he thought about it. He thought, specifically, about the question he had raised with Richard in that office in the early 2000s, the transparency question, the warning he had delivered at the door, and about Richard's answer, "I know." The two words that had hung in the air of that office for 20 years, that had never been revisited, that had proven, in the end, to be exactly as accurate as Thomas had feared and Richard had acknowledged. He had known. He had known, and he had built the structures anyway, because the knowing was not the same as the ability to choose differently. And Thomas, who had spent 40 years watching people make decisions that their own knowledge could not modify, understood that without being able to make it easier, The journalist who eventually wrote the most complete account of the Calloway story was a woman named Deborah Marsh, who worked for a regional business publication based in Charlotte, and who had obtained, through a combination of the partial public record and a series of deep background conversations with people close to the proceedings, a picture of the story, comprehensive enough to tell it in something approaching its full complexity. She spent 14 months on the piece. She spoke to 7 attorneys, 3 financial forensic experts, 2 of Daniel's former business associates, 4 people from Margaret's professional life, and, after considerable persuasion, a single conversation with Caroline, which Caroline had agreed to on the condition that it be entirely off the record and used only to correct factual errors in what Deborah had already assembled. The article ran in the spring of the year following Richard's death. It was the longest piece the publication had ever run. It was read, in the first week after publication, by more people than had read the publication's entire print edition in the previous year. Not because it was scandalous. It was not written as a scandal, and Deborah had resisted the framing that would have made it more easily viral but less true. It was read because it was honest, because it treated everyone in it as a full human being, including Richard, including Daniel, including Margaret, because it ended not with a verdict, but with a question, because it asked, in its final paragraphs, what we as a society make of the particular kind of love that expresses itself through control and protection and secrecy, and whether the instinct to protect the people we love from knowledge is itself a form of love or a form of failure, and whether those two things can be, in the same act, simultaneously true. The response to the article was enormous and was almost entirely focused on Margaret, not on Richard, whose choices drove the plot, and not on Daniel, whose actions provided its drama, but on Margaret, on the question of what it means to build a whole life inside a story that someone else has written for you, and on what it takes, at 60 years old, to pick up a pen and start writing your own. The comments, the letters to the editor, the messages that Deborah received in the weeks after publication came overwhelmingly from women who recognized something. Not the specifics. Most of them had not been married to secret billionaires, and most of them had not faced competency petitions or 47-page forensic reports. But the structure of it, the experience of living inside someone else's managed version of reality, of trusting so completely and so reasonably that the possibility of fundamental deception had simply not been a category of thought, of arriving at a moment of revelation and finding yourself required to reconstruct not just your understanding of your circumstances, but your understanding of yourself, of the choices you had made, of the intelligence you had applied, of what it meant that all of that intelligence had not been enough to see what was hidden directly beneath you. That experience was not rare. That experience, at different scales and in different configurations, was something that women across the country recognized in themselves. And Margaret, in her measured, specific, unself-pitying way, had become, without intending to, a public articulation of something many of them had never found language for. Richard Calloway was buried in Asheville, in the cemetery where his father Gerald is buried. Caroline arranged the service. She chose a small gathering, in keeping with her father's lifelong preference for the private over the public, and the group that assembled at the graveside, attorneys, business associates, the handful of people who had genuinely known him, was modest in size and entirely comfortable with its own silence in the way of people gathered for a man who had never required noise. Thomas Wren attended. He stood at the back of the small gathering and was not introduced to anyone and did not introduce himself, and after the service, he walked to the graveside and stood there alone for a few minutes after the others had gone. Patricia waited for him by the car. When he came back, he said nothing, and she asked nothing, and they drove the 3 hours back to Raleigh in the specific companionable quiet of a long marriage that has learned what to leave alone. Margaret was present at the service. She sat in the 3rd row. She did not cry, though she had cried, in private, the morning she heard. She had called Caroline the evening of the day he died, and the conversation had been short and had not required many words, because there are conversations between two women who have both loved the same complicated man that do not need many words. What they said to each other in those minutes was private, and stayed private. What it produced A quiet, sustained closeness between a former mother-in-law and a daughter that has continued in the years since was its own kind of resolution. Not the resolution the story seemed to be building toward, but the one it actually arrived at. Let's talk about what this story means. Not in the abstract, not in the way of tidy moral lessons delivered from a comfortable distance, but in the specific, human, difficult way of a story that resists simplification because it was lived by people who contained, as people do, contradictions that cannot be resolved from the outside. Richard Calloway was a man whose deepest fear produced his greatest achievement and his greatest failure simultaneously. He was afraid of being destroyed by trust, and so he built structures that guaranteed the people who trusted him could never be fully trusted in return. The structures held. The money was protected. The estate passed intact to the people he intended to receive it. By every financial and legal measure, his plan succeeded. By every human and relational measure, it exacted the price that Thomas Wren had predicted at that office door 20 years before it was paid. It cost him his marriage. It cost him his son, not to death, but to the distance that comes after a breach of that magnitude, a distance that maps onto the same coordinates as grief. It cost him 34 years of a partnership that could have been different, and that he, on his deathbed, was honest enough with Caroline to say should have been different. Not the empire, the secrecy around the empire. Those were not the same thing. He had built them as if they were. They were not. Margaret's story is a story about what happens when the ground shifts and you are standing on it. She had not been passive, not been naive, not been complicit in any sense that involves agency or choice. She had been managed, skillfully and with love, by a man who believed management was the same as protection. When the management was revealed, she had the option, real, available, taken by some women in comparable situations, of allowing the revelation to define her, of building her identity around what had been done to her. She took a different option. She took the harder one. She took the one that required her to examine not just what Richard had done, but what she herself had accepted without examination, and to hold both of those things without resolving the discomfort between them into a clean narrative where she was simply right and he was simply wrong. She held the complexity. She carried it. She turned it, over years, into something that helped other people. That is not a small thing. That is, in its way, the most significant thing anyone in this story did. Daniel's story is unfinished in the way that the stories of people who are still alive are always unfinished. The last that is known of him, from the partial public record, is that he is living in Raleigh, working in a consultancy capacity for a small manufacturing company, and that he has not been in contact with his sister or his mother in any documented way since the conclusion of the legal proceedings. Whether that distance is temporary or permanent is a question only the people involved can answer. Whether he has found, in the years since the catastrophe of his own making, the thing that would have made the catastrophe unnecessary, which is to say, a sense of himself that does not depend on what his father had or chose to give, is a question this story cannot answer. It can only ask. Caroline's story is also unfinished and likely to remain so for many years because she is still building the thing she set out to build, and she is building it with the same patient, systematic, unhurried commitment that she has brought to everything in her adult life. The Compass Fund is in its second decade. The educational programs the foundation supports have been replicated in 4 states. She has not spoken publicly about any of what happened. She has not written about it. She has not, as far as anyone can tell, spent significant energy on the story itself, because she understands, as her father understood, as her mother eventually understood, that the story is not the point. The work is the point, the work that comes after the story, the structural response to the structural problem, the thing that will still be working when everyone who lived through the original event is gone. And Thomas Wren, in his garden in Raleigh, plants what he plants and tends what he tends and thinks, on certain mornings, about a man he worked for 30 years, who built an empire and kept it secret, and loved his family, and cost them greatly, and was right about some things, and wrong about the most important one. He does not judge. He is too old and has seen too much to judge. But he thinks, and what he thinks, most often, is something simple enough that he is slightly embarrassed by its simplicity. given the complexity of everything it took to arrive at it. He thinks, the things we protect from the people we love are almost always the things we should be sharing with them. Not because sharing makes them safe, but because the protection itself, in the end, is the most dangerous thing of all. That is this story. All of it. Not a morality play, not a cautionary tale. A true accounting of what happens when fear and love build the same house and discover, over decades, that they cannot share it. What happens to the house? What happens to the people inside it? What it takes to find your way out? And what, if anything, can be built in the space that remains? Drop your answer in the comments right now. I want to know, were you more moved by Margaret, by Richard, or by Caroline? And why? Because the answer to that question will tell you something real about yourself, something about where you locate accountability, something about where you locate grace. And if this story reached inside you and rearranged something, subscribe. Because the next story we are bringing you is the one I mentioned at the close of our last video. The woman who discovered at 58 years old that her husband's entire career, the one that had funded their whole life and put their children through school and paid for the vacations and the retirement account and the modest sense of security she had built her identity around, had been built on a fraud that had been running for 22 years. And the FBI knocked on her door on a Tuesday morning, and she had 24 hours to decide what to do. That story is coming, and I promise you, it is even more complicated than this one.